Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today along with some help from Craig to give you my definitive review of the brand new TTArtisan, that's the Thinking Artisan 40mm F2.8 1:1 macro lens. Now, it's in the last month or so, this is the second of these inexpensive 1:1 macro lenses that I've been able to review. The last being the 7 Artisan's 60mm F2.8. So that lens on APS-C behaves more like 90mm. This lens behaves more like a 60mm lens on full frame. And that is a focal length that I actually really like for a lot of reasons. I primarily use for my product type photography and macro work, I primarily use the Voigtlander 65mm f2. And so this, of course, lens behaves very similarly to that, although this is a 1:1 full life-size macro lens, while my Voigtlander is only a 1:2. But what really made this lens stand out to me from other inexpensive, macro type lenses or lenses like this is how incredibly sharp and how good at macro it actually is, for reasons that we'll detail as a part of this review. First of all, however, a word from our sponsor. Today's episode is brought to you by Phantom Wallet, the minimalist, modern wallet that sets you free from the bulky traditional wallet while also making it easy to access your cards and money when you need them, thanks to their unique fanning mechanism. Visit phantomwallet.com to check out their unique sizes, styles, and finishes that span from aluminum to wood to carbon fiber. You can even customize your wallet with new accessories like a money clip, cash holder, ID display, and even the Chipolo tracking integration if you're the kind of person who loses their wallet. Use code DUSTIN15 for 15% off when you're ready to check out. From the moment that I took this lens out of the box, I was impressed by the quality of the build. It has a really great feeling manual focus ring. It's made all of metal. All of it is very good. The one thing that I didn't like, as well as the 7 Artisan 60mm, is that lens was an internally focusing design. This is not, and so it will extend as you focus, and we'll detail more of that on the build in just a moment. But from the moment I started to use it and saw the optical results, I was incredibly impressed, and we'll get to that in just a moment. First of all, let me give you a closer look and detail the build and the design here for you. We'll take a closer look at that. Okay, let's take a closer look at the 40mm f2.8. The first thing that stands out is that this lens, when it's retracted, is a nice and compact lens. It's just coming to market, but I measure it overall at about 75 millimeters in length. However, this is not an internally focusing design, and so when you fully extend it out, it's more like 120 millimeters in length when it's at full 1:1 macro level. And of course, being made all of metal, as you can see here, a very, very nice quality of construction. This lens weighs in at roughly 372 grams, which is still nice and lightweight. However, it is not super light because of being out of such quality materials. In some ways, the design here is a little bit retro looking to me. Kind of think, maybe early 2000s Canon with the focus ring here. It kind of bulges out from the barrel a little bit, and it does have a ribbing, but it's more like slots that are throughout here. It grips fine, and most importantly, the actual manual focus ring moves beautifully. It is very, very nicely damped. Very precise. There's no wobble or anything to it. For a lens this inexpensive, this is a really, really nicely made lens. And I also noted that it has a nice amount of focus throw here. And so that helps a lot in getting precision. I think somewhere around 270, 280 degrees of rotation. And it also has a reasonable amount after the 1 meter point, which is right here, and gives you a little bit of precision to work with in the focus throw there, which is really kind of important to me. Now, this is a fully manual lens, so there are no any kind of electronics here at the lens mount, and so there are certain things that you're going to have to manually put in. You're going to have to employ the setting to allow the camera to know to, it'll say to release shutter without lens attached, which obviously you're not actually wanting to do it without a lens attached, but what you are wanting to do is for it to release the shutter with a lens like this that's not communicating with the camera. The other thing you're going to want to do in the case of the A6600 or a similar type camera that does have in-body image stabilization is you're going to need to manually input the focal length. It does have a manual aperture ring, and that aperture ring does rotate in the opposite direction of what a lot of other aperture rings do. And so you advance to the right rather than to the left. And not a huge deal, but it may, if you have muscle memory for other manual focus rings, that might throw you a little bit. We have an aperture range of 2.8 to 16 here. This is a clicked ring. It is not a declicked aperture ring. Inside we have a nice aperture iris, and the aperture iris has 11 blades, keeps a nice circular shape. There is no included lens hood, but you'll probably have noted, as I did, that this lens, the front element, is very far recessed inside of it. So there is a lot of a natural lens hood effect that is taking place here. Not to say that the lens is impervious to flare. However, it does have, by its natural design, some flare resistance because it is so deeply recessed. Our minimum focus distance here is down to 0.17 or 17 centimeters, and that is what gives you the 1-to-1. And so you're getting fairly close by the time you account for this barrel extension and, of course, to the sensor of the camera. And so just to give you an idea, if I go to that mark, we are at roughly 140 centimeters, which means you only have about 3 centimeters of working distance in front of the front element. And so you will have to get really, really close to your subject to get full 1-to-1 macro. That's partly due to the fact that this is a relatively short focal length. It corresponds to roughly 60 millimeters, depending on what camera system you're using. On the Sony, with a 1.5 times crop factor, that is a 60 millimeter full frame equivalent. Now, one minor quibble I do have about the build and design is, first of all, my kind of pre-release copy, it came with an improperly branded front cap here. And it's actually for the 50 millimeter f1.2, which obviously shares a front filter threading. But what I don't like is that this cap needs to be threaded into place on the filter threads, and it's just a little bit of a slow process to either mount or unmount it. And I recommend grabbing a third-party pinch cap. This actually isn't the perfect size here. I've got one on order that you can pinch into place and thus take on and off much simpler. So probably the most important takeaway from the build segment is just how good the manual focus ring is. Truth of the matter is that most macro photographers do use manual focus at least some point during their macro photography, and many macro photographers actually prefer a good manual focus ring. And because it gives you finite control, depth of field is tiny at macro ranges, and so it gives you more finite control of where focus is going to be and helps you to really be able to control the creative vision. And so that is valued, and obviously to be able to get precision with a good quality manual focus ring is incredibly important. Now, one thing that you will find that is a potential negative is that as you begin to go in towards macro distance, you will find very similar to a zooming type effect as you approach a subject, and it grows and grows in the frame. And it gives you an impression very much like a focus breathing. So that might be off-putting to those of you who are video oriented. And as you can see here, just the size of subjects does really change depending upon the perspective of where it's at in the manual focus range. But I really did enjoy the manual focus process with this lens, and even more so the results, which we'll get to in just a second. First of all, however, let's get a little bit of feedback from Craig when it comes to using this lens for macro work.
Kind of in regards of using a macro lens, it's a very different thing for me, but it does have its place. Now for me, its place isn't necessarily out in nature. To me, its place would more be in a studio setting, because with this, you can get 1-to-1 ratio. You can do it, but you have to get so close. I mean, if you are outside trying to take a video of a flower, well, if you live in any place where there is wind, the flower is going to be moving, and so your footage is going to be shaky. And of course, this doesn't have stabilization, and it's going to make it look pretty rough. Now, some things that I noticed here. It goes f2.8 all the way to f16. In low light, it's pretty rough whenever you zoom in all the way to a 1-to-1 ratio. I found that I had to boost the ISO all the way up to whatever it was, 36,000, or I can't remember what it was, but I had to boost the ISO all the way up. Compared to whenever I was zoomed out, the ISO was at about 6,000 and it was doing fine. Now there is noise and there is grain, but as far as kind of the style of the video that we have here, it fits in, it's not too bad. Would you use this lens out in the world, just traveling about for non-macro purposes? I really don't see why you would. Is it possible? Yes, although you do have quite a finite amount of focus space, so it's not certainly something I would recommend. If you are looking for a one and done lens that you do not have to change out, then obviously this isn't it because it's a macro lens. But if you are looking for a macro lens that is going to be good in a studio setting where you have time and you can set everything up and there's nothing kind of inhibiting you and you have control of every situation as far as lighting. For example, you would have seen the low light footage. Well, I wasn't super happy with it, so I went back and shot it with some good lighting. I went over to Dustin's house, grabbed his lights, set it up, backlit it, front lit it, put some good lighting all around in general in it, and you will see it. I have not color edited it. I have not done anything in post, and it looks good. It looks good. I mean, we're talking about a tiny watch. You're going into the micro components of it, and it looks good. It's incredible how much you can zoom up on that. Given that there's no image stabilization, you have to get a tripod. You have to settle it down or your shots are just not going to work. So overall, is this a good lens for video? Yes. However, caveat, in certain situations, I would kind of refrain this to studio controlled environment shooting.
So I'm going to add a little bit of technical nuance to one of the observations that Craig made, and that was the challenge of getting video, or for that matter, stills, when you're up close in the macro range. This is a lens with a maximum aperture of f2.8. It has a minimum aperture of f16. However, in this case, because you're setting the aperture physically, it's not going to change electronically. And so it seemed like there was a lot of loss of light there. So it seemed like the aperture was actually closing down. And in a sense it was, though not in a physical sense. That aperture, if it's set at f2.8, it's always going to be an f2.8 size. But the laws of physics says that as you start to get very close to a subject, you get into that macro range, that the effective aperture, the way that that aperture behaves, starts to change. And so you will have a similar effect to the aperture closing because less light is able to reach the sensor due to that higher degree of magnification. It's one of those quirks that a lot of people don't understand, and in some cases the lens will actually report a smaller aperture than what is set. So people will say, this is not really an f2.8 lens. It doesn't work at f2.8 in macro range. Well, actually it does have an f2.8 aperture, but all apertures their behavior changes when you get very close. Nonetheless, this does create a very real challenge. That if you're going to do macro photography or videography, you have to have either a well-lit subject, particularly when you're getting so close, only about 3 centimeters away at 1:1. So you're going to have good lighting on your subject, either naturally, or you're going to have to provide that lighting through a macro ring light or some other source of light. And so as Craig noted, that allowed him to have a lot more greater control over the ISO setting that he could use and thus get cleaner, better looking results out of that. That's going to be true whether you're doing stills or video, and it's a reality of that. The other reality that is there is that obviously on a body like the A6600 or some Fuji bodies, some Micro Four Thirds bodies, you might get in-body image stabilization. That obviously does help to do handheld macro, but holding something steady when you're that much magnified and depth of field is so thin is a really challenging thing. So like most macro lenses, you'll probably get your best results off of a tripod for that kind of work. But you can get some really impressive results out of this lens. And from the moment I saw the MTF and I started to use it, I was impressed because the MTF shows a lens that is very sharp from wide open across almost all the frame with only a very minor drop off right at the very edge of the frame, though still quite strong. And that is what I found in real life. Let's dive in and take a look at that. So as per usual, we'll start by taking a look at the vignette and distortion. You can see, taking a look at my test chart, that there is only a minimal amount of distortion here, very little to correct. We'll get to that in just a second. There's a little bit more noticeable amount of vignette, mostly concentrated into the corners. On the right side, you see what I was able to achieve through a manual correction. And remember, this is a lens that doesn't have electronic contacts, which means that it's not going to be communicating anything to a camera about an automatic profile, even if such a profile existed. So my corrections included a +2 for distortion, so just a very mild amount of barrel distortion, which as you can see corrected no problem. And then vignette is just a moderate, about a stop and a half in the corner, +45, and then moving the midpoint over gave me the result that I wanted. Now, what allows this lens to have fantastic contrast and acuity is the fact that longitudinal chromatic aberrations are extraordinarily well controlled. And I say extraordinarily not just for an inexpensive lens, but this is an extraordinary result for any kind of lens. And so you can see here with the text, which is a torture test that a lot of times many lenses fail, you can see that even at f2.8, the contrast and detail that it goes from the white of the page, and of course you can see even the fiber of the page in the Bible there, to the black of the text, that it really is remarkable how good, and you see no evidence of green fringing beyond. That really is kind of a mind-blowing result for a lens at this price point. Furthermore, we can see that lateral chromatic aberrations are also very well controlled, and so you can see that there really isn't any kind of fringing in the transition area from the black to the white near the edges of the frame. So first of all, my sharpness test is done here on a 24 megapixel Sony a6600. On the right side, just for a comparison point, I have the TTArtisan 40mm. So first of all, looking in the center of the frame, you can see that there's a fairly radical difference in the amount of contrast and acuity that the TTArtisan lens has, which is really, really impressive. Moving to the mid-frame, that result continues to be much better. You can just see that it's a little bit more hazy on the TTArtisans. Now down in the corner, it's actually the opposite is true, and the TTArtisan shows a little bit better here in the corner. So as always, out of curiosity, I wanted to know if this was just a focus related thing, and you can see that in many ways it is. If I focused in the corner, you can see that the sharpness results are considerably better. And so that is actually good news, because it means that in real world use, the sharpness is going to matter where you're focused. And so at f2.8, even if you focus near the edge of the frame, you can get quite a good result. Now, to give some perspective and this is all the way down to 1:1, this is 100% magnification instead of 200%, we can see that even moving out to the edge of the frame on this bill at the center of my chart, you can see how really good the results are, that even if I do get off near the edge of the frame, that I'm still getting quite strong results. This is marred a little bit by some tape that is there, but overall we're getting a very strong result here. And in the real world, that translates into, really sharp, very crisp images. In fact, I actually didn't even know this little spider was here in this tiny little marigold blossom. I was just focusing on the edge of the leaf and only discovered the spider afterwards. And so it really is impressive how crisp a result we're getting even at f2.8. So back to 200% magnification here, we can see stopping down from f2.8 to f4 further improves contrast to very impressive levels. And in the mid-frame is looking excellent now. It's only in the corner where things aren't as impressive, though I found at f4, if I focused in the corner, actually got a nice sharp result. We'll take a look up in the other corner. We can see it's not really a centering issue, and up here we can see a similar type of result as well. Going from f4 to f5.6 gives you a little bit further a bump in contrast to truly excellent levels in the center of the frame. The mid-frame is truly excellent. Looking down here, you can see that we're a very strong result here. And down into the corner, it is looking better. And at different places that we look, overall the performance is looking better. Here, kind of the mid-frame, it looks really, really crisp right down into the corner. So that means that smaller apertures for landscape images, you can see that the results are really crisp, beautifully detailed. Color rendition is quite good. Everything here is looking quite excellent. So what that means for macro work is that you're able to get good detail even wide open. So here on the left side, you can see there's really good results. However, you'll also find that depth of field is incredibly tiny. I mean, you can see here on the edge of this little coin, there's just a few of these little notches that are in focus. So you're going to want to stop down significantly, as I have on the right side, to allow for greater depth of field and thus to get a little bit more in focus if that is your desire. Move a little bit further away, and so you can see the coin that we have been working on at a 1:1 level. This is more of like a 1:2 level, and you can see all of the great detail that is there. And if I stop down a bit, I'm able to get really fantastic macro results. Macro lenses are a lot of fun, giving you different perspective on familiar objects. Now, another thing that really impressed me is the geometry of the aperture iris. And so you can see here that surprisingly, right off to the edge of the frame, we have a really nice circular shape at f2.8. And those 11 rounded aperture blades do a pretty amazing job of maintaining that circular shape. So here's f4, here is f5.6, and you can see that we are continuing to keep a really nice circular shape, which is going to do nice things for the bokeh. Here we have the morning dew on the grass, and so you can see how great the detail is there. Here there's lots of opportunity for fringing. We're really not seeing it, and you can see that the quality of the bokeh, the circles everywhere, look really great. Here's another image where you can see that the bokeh is nice and soft behind, the subject is nice and crisp in the foreground, and even our foreground bokeh looks quite nice here as well. And so obviously you're going to be able to create some really good looking results. Here's step back a little bit, and you can see that the bokeh circles in the background look really beautiful. And of course, what's so impressive about this lens is that if I go into a pixel level, you can see the great detail and contrast that is there in this image from, about 1.5, 2 feet away, half a meter or so. Now, as noted, the lens doesn't come with a lens hood other than the deep recess of the design. What I found is that you can see there's just starting to be a little bit of a veiling in the corner of the frame. However, there's not really any kind of ghosting artifacts. Here in this image with the sun right out of the frame, you can see some kind of like shafts of light, kind of like some prismatic results there. A little bit of loss of contrast. To me, that's quite an artistic look, and so not something that turns me off personally. Stopping down a little bit, and you can see that you can get a little bit of a ghosting artifact, but overall it's a pretty nice result. It's not going to give you the world's most distinct sunburst or sunstar effect, but it doesn't look bad either. So finally, one of the curiosities that I often encounter with APS-C lenses is people want to know how much of a full frame sensor that it covers. So in this case, you can see that it actually covers considerably more than just the APS-C portion of the frame. Now, there is a significant amount here that is completely blacked out. And that's from the mechanical vignette of not covering full frame. However, if I crop out all of that black area, I get this result here. And if I put that side by side with the APS-C result, APS-C crop on the right, you can see that we've got considerably wider available. And so I would say that this covers probably an additional 15 to 20% of the frame beyond the APS-C crop factor. So just another aspect of the lens performance that helps it to achieve maybe better results on the APS-C sensors that it's designed for. So obviously, if you're going to do macro photography, that really does demand a lot of contrast and a lot of great acuity at macro distances. Not all cheap macro lenses provide that. The TTArtisan 40mm F2.8 definitely does. And to me, that makes it the most valuable, inexpensive macro lens that I've ever used. And I don't know of any lens that's in the $150 US range, which is where they're projecting this lens will sell at. I don't know of any lens that's going to give you a better macro performance for that kind of money. So to me, if you are someone who's wanting to experiment with macro, or you won't shoot macro often, but you wouldn't mind having a good quality result on a small budget, take a look at this TTArtisan 40mm F2.8. It delivers fantastic bang for your buck. And I suspect that that's what a lot of you are out there looking for. So thanks for checking in today, and of course, if you look in the description down below, you can find linkage to my text review along with the image gallery. You can find linkage there to purchase my merchandise, to follow Craig or myself on social media, sign up for my newsletter, become a patron, and of course, if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Ring that bell so you get notifications when new content drops. Thanks for watching, have a great day, and let the light in.